Hello, and thank you for coming back. Tonight, we will step together into a city that seems to exist between two worlds. A Prague of gray stone, thin mist, and Gothic streets so narrow that even the sound of footsteps feels as though it is echoing back from centuries ago. This is a place where bridges do not merely cross a river, but cross time itself. A place where church bells can divide an entire day into slow, lingering rhythms, and also a place where, beneath the shadow of its towers, human beings once tried to understand the universe through both the telescope and the alchemical furnace. If tonight you are lying down after a long day, let your shoulders soften just a little more. Adjust your pillow. Pull the blanket up until it feels just warm enough, and allow the outside world to slowly drift away. For the time ahead, you do not need to go anywhere at all. We will simply let Prague open its doors to us, without haste, without noise, moving instead with a gentle rhythm, like mist gliding over the surface of the Vltava near midnight. Tonight, we will pass through a Prague of emperors and scholars, of alchemists, astronomical clocks, bell towers, strange collections, and ordinary people living beneath the shadow of a city that seems always to be listening to itself. We will encounter Prague again as it became the capital of an empire, as the night sky above its rooftops was measured with an almost sacred patience, and as the sound of bells remained part of the city's breathing. Before we begin, leave me a comment and let me know where you are listening from, and whether it is nighttime, early morning, or a quiet afternoon where you are. And now, lower the lights, take one slow breath, and step with me into Prague in the age of alchemy, church bells, and Gothic streets. Prague first appears like a form called forth from the mist. It is not a city that burst forth at once in light, nor a place that introduces itself through the noise of a square or the echo of horse hooves striking stone. It arrives more slowly than that. First comes the dark surface of the Vltava, like a ribbon of black silk lying beneath embankments and bridge piers. Then the rooftops begin to emerge in layers, the sharp towers gradually separating themselves from the pale sky, and the old walls, which throughout the night were nothing but shadows, suddenly carry the peculiar heaviness of stone that has stood there for many centuries. If there is any city in Europe that makes one feel that time does not merely pass but settles and remains, Prague is among the places closest to that feeling. Its historic center, with the Old Town, Lesser Town, and New Town, is described by UNESCO as an urban space that developed continuously from the 11th to the 18th century, where many major works from the age of Charles IV still shape the city's appearance to this day. And so, if tonight we wish to begin the story of Prague in the age of alchemy, church bells, and Gothic streets, then we cannot begin at once with furnaces, astronomical drawings, or the court of Rudolph II. We must begin with the very body of this city, with stone, with river, with the sloping steps that lead upward toward the castle district, with the feeling that everything here seems to have been built not merely to be used, but to outlast a human life. Prague is not the kind of city that can be read in a single glance. It does not open itself at once into straight axes and broad empty spaces. It keeps for itself winding passages, turns, stretches of wall, narrow courtyards, dark gates, and it is precisely that slow rhythm of movement that gives one the feeling of stepping into a place that is in no hurry to trust a stranger. Perhaps that is also why Prague belongs so well to the night, to mist, to the sound of distant bells, and to stories told in a low voice, as though history here does not need to be shouted, only listened to for long enough. On one side of the city lies Hradčany, the castle district above, where Prague Castle has held the position of central power for more than 1,000 years. That place is not merely a single fortress, but an architectural complex, one layer laid upon another of Bohemian power, of royalty, of empire, of church and ceremony. According to the official history of Prague Castle, from the time of Charles IV in the mid-14th century, this place entered a great period of prosperity, becoming for the first time the residence of an emperor and the seat of the head of the Holy Roman Empire. Gothic structures were expanded, the royal palace was rebuilt, the fortifications were strengthened, and St. Vitus Cathedral began to take on the shape of imperial ambition. That means that even before Prague became the city of alchemists under Rudolf II, it had long been a city of symbols of power, where architecture was not simply a place of shelter, but the means by which a dynasty carved its image into stone and sky. Below the castle, across the river, are the remaining parts of another Prague, the Old Town, the Lesser Town, the old roads, the squares, and the administrative buildings that made this city not only a place where kings lived, but a true urban body during the centuries of Prague's growth, especially under Charles IV. The city did not merely expand in size, it was shaped as a capital acutely aware of its own role. Britannica records that Charles IV made Prague his capital from 1346 to 1378 and took a deep personal interest in the city's development. That did not simply mean building more structures. It meant turning Prague into a point of convergence for political, cultural, and religious prestige. Centuries later, when people speak of Prague as a city of sharp towers and gray stone, the shadow of Charles IV is still there, like a deep foundational layer with which every later age has had to live. Between those parts of the city, stretched across the Vltava like a link between power and daily life, is Charles Bridge. But if we want to see this bridge as it truly once was, we must set aside for a moment the image of the crowded tourist site of today. Imagine instead a sandstone bridge built to replace Judith Bridge, which had been badly damaged by flooding in 1342. The new work began in 1357 under the patronage of Charles IV and was completed in 1402. For many centuries, this was the most important bridge across the Vltava in Prague, the great connection between the castle, the Old Town, and the other parts of the city. It was not merely a way across the river, it was a backbone, a trade route, a part of the ceremonial path, a place through which people, goods, power, and symbols all had to pass. If Prague is a body, then this bridge is a pulse of stone. That is why it is no surprise that so many stories of Prague ought to begin on a bridge. On a cold morning, when the mist has not yet fully lifted, the water below may be dark as metal, while the towers at either end of the bridge emerge like gatehouses of a city that knows very well what it is. At the Old Town end, the Gothic bridge tower is not merely a defensive structure. It is also a kind of ceremonial gateway, an entrance into the heart of the city. Prague city tourism and the official descriptions of the historic center alike emphasize that structures such as Charles Bridge, St. Vitus Cathedral, and the major churches and palaces were largely built or strongly shaped under Charles IV. This matters very much because it shows that Prague did not become mysterious later through legend. It was built from the beginning as a city that wished to present itself to the world through mass, through visual axes, and through the endurance of stone. From the bridge, looking into the city, one can begin to understand why Prague became one of the most fertile places for stories that are half history and half reflection. The rooftops do not stand alone. They gather in layers, leaning close together as though the whole city had grown through the accumulation of many centuries. The bell towers do not merely rise, they divide the sky into vertical measures, so that the skyline always resembles a frozen piece of music. The walls do not simply enclose, they hold darkness a little longer in the morning and receive the golden light a little longer in the late afternoon. As if the stone of Prague possessed a memory of its own. In such a city, even sound seems older. Footsteps on stone, wind moving through a narrow passage, bells echoing from somewhere unseen. All of it creates what we might call the material memory of the city, a memory that does not live only in books, but on the stone itself, in the arches, in the walls that have looked down upon the same current of people for generation after generation. And it is precisely that memory which will allow the later parts of this story to unfold naturally. For only in a city already accustomed to living with symbol, with ceremony, and with a sense of time can one understand why bells, astronomical clocks, alchemy, and strange rooms of collection could exist together without ever seeming discordant. In Prague, such things do not feel as though they belong to separate worlds. They seem instead like different ways by which the people here once tried to read the order of the world, through sound, through the movements of the sky, through matter itself, and through the desire to gather the strange things of creation within the reach of their sight. In the center of the Old Town, the Old Town Hall also gives Prague another rhythm, more worldly perhaps, yet no less symbolic. This city hall was established in 1338 as the seat of the Old Town's government, and its oldest part consists of the southern wing, with its Gothic tower and the famous astronomical clock later known as the horloge. Although in this opening part of the story, we do not yet go deeply into that clock, its presence still feels like a promise from afar. For in a city where urban governance, time, public ceremony, and the heavens can all appear together on the facade of a single building, one can already see the seed of the Prague that would later come into being. A Prague where people lived within ordinary life, while always lifting their eyes toward the signals of an order greater than themselves. The city hall, therefore, is not merely a place of administration. It is a place where time is made public before the people, where the city hears and sees itself in the very midst of daily life, among footsteps, stalls, and the square. Prague always leaves room for the feeling that human beings are living within a rhythm larger than themselves, the rhythm of hours, of seasons, of ceremony, and of history itself quietly passing through the old stone walls. But what makes Prague special is not merely that it possesses great buildings. Many European cities have churches, castles, stone bridges, and squares. What is different here is the feeling that these layers are still held close together in Prague. The distance between the place of worship, the place of rule, the place of trade, and the place of passage has not been pushed too far apart in one's spatial feeling. One can move from a bridge to a square, from a narrow lane to a tower, from a crowded street up to a high place overlooking the whole city, and still feel that an invisible thread binds everything together. That thread is history, though not the history that lies in books. It is the history that remains in the city's arrangement itself, in where a road leads, in what a gate opens onto, in how many generations have worn down the paving stones beneath one's feet. And precisely because Prague's historic center still preserves such a remarkable degree of integrity, the modern visitor entering it can still read some part of that structure with the naked eye, almost without needing to try. Perhaps that is why Prague so often gives the feeling of standing on the threshold of something, not exactly a secret in the sensational sense, but an old feeling of expectancy, as if the city already knows that in the centuries to come it will still have to receive strange emperors, scholars who look up into the sky, craftsmen who work with metal and fire, collectors who wish to gather the world into closed rooms, and bells that will go on dividing day and night for generation after generation of inhabitants. But all of that, in this first part, still lies ahead. For now, Prague is only the stage upon which those things will appear, a city of stone and mist, heavy, slow, ancient, built to endure longer than a single life, and therefore patient enough to wait for history itself to enter. And so tonight, before we go more deeply into the enclosed laboratories, the courts crowded with strange collections, or the skies that Prague's astronomers once read like a text, we will linger here a little longer on the cold stone, in the thin river mist, beneath towers not yet fully lit. For every great city, before it becomes a story, must first be a place. And Prague, more than many others, still retains the power to be a place before it becomes a symbol. It can still appear in the imagination not as a lesson, but as a very early morning, when one stands upon the bridge, watching the city slowly rise out of darkness, and suddenly feels that one is looking not only at an old capital of Europe, but at one of the very ways human beings once built their world, with stone, with faith, with power, and with the desire to leave behind a shape enduring enough to stand before time. There are cities that never truly lose their place. They simply pass through periods of retreat into a deeper shadow, waiting for another moment to be called forth again. Prague is such a city. After its glorious age under Charles IV, it was still there with its churches, bridges, squares, and castle, still the heart of Bohemia. Yet it no longer held the same political intensity as it had when an emperor still placed the full weight of the empire upon the city's shoulders. And then, in 1583, a shift took place. Rudolf II moved his court from Vienna to Prague. According to Britannica, that decision made the capital of Bohemia once more the residence of the emperor and a vibrant political and cultural center. It was not merely a change of address. It was the moment when the heartbeat of an entire world of power changed direction. Seen from afar, one might easily imagine the event as an administrative decision, a monarch choosing a new residence, a court moving from one city to another, a few wagons, a few rooms being prepared, a few ceremonies arranged. But in truth, where an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire chose to settle was never merely a matter of convenience. an entire network of power would follow him: nobles, ambassadors, attendants, scholars, artists, craftsmen, suppliers of goods, letters, news, ambition, jealousy, favor, and rivalry. When the court arrived, the city did not merely become more crowded, it became denser. The corridors filled with more whispers, the squares received more processions of people. Houses near the center took on a different value. The stairways leading up toward the castle district grew more familiar with the footsteps of those carrying letters, commands, and petitions. An imperial capital is not made by architecture alone. It is made when a city becomes the place that every road of interest begins to seek out. Rudolf II was an especially fitting figure to create such a Prague. Britannica describes him as an emperor who was at once a patron of art and science and a deeply complex man. One who often withdrew into a secluded life in Prague and suffered serious mental breakdowns. It was that mixture that made his court unlike a machinery functioning only for war or administration. It resembled a world stretched between political power and intellectual curiosity, between inner unease and the ambition to leave a mark outwardly. When such a man chose Prague, he did not merely use the city as a residence. He turned it into an extension of himself. Prague Castle, therefore, began to change its role. It was no longer only an ancient symbol of Bohemian kingship or a historical complex inherited from earlier generations. Under Rudolf II, it gradually moved away from the appearance of a center of power, living only by old memory and ceremony, and became instead a space in motion, expanding, being prepared for a new form of empire. According to the official history of Prague Castle, it was precisely in this period that the process of adaptation and transformation of the castle reached its height. The emperor settled there permanently and began turning it into a grand center, worthy of the stature he wanted Prague to lend to his dynasty. That did not simply mean refurbishing a few chambers or adding new functional spaces. It meant that the entire castle complex began to be reimagined as the true heart of the court. Spaces that had once carried meanings of defense, ceremony, or residence now had to bear another task as well, becoming places where power could display its refinement. It was also during this period that the northern wing of the palace was built, including the space later known as the Spanish Hall, intended to house Rudolf's precious collections of art and science. That detail alone is enough to show that Prague Castle was no longer merely a place to live or to rule from. It was becoming the place where the empire presented itself through beauty, rarity, and knowledge. These changes may sound, at first glance, like matters of architecture, but in truth, they reveal something much greater. Rudolf did not simply live in the castle, he redefined it. He turned this place, already ancient, into a new machine of authority, aesthetics, and knowledge, within walls that had witnessed generations of Bohemian kings. A different rhythm of life now appeared, more discreet, more refined, and more ambitious. Power no longer manifested itself only in the throne, in ceremony, or in formal audiences. It also appeared in rooms filled with paintings, sculptures, precious materials, scientific instruments, and objects that made one feel the world itself could be reduced, rearranged, and placed beneath the emperor's gaze. Thus, under Rudolf II, Prague Castle was no longer merely the residence of a monarch. It became a miniature image of his very age, a place where power, art, and the longing to understand began to stand very close together. And from that moment on, the castle no longer looked down upon Prague as a relic of the past. It looked down upon the city as the living center of an empire that wished to rewrite itself. Imagine Prague Castle in those years not as a quiet place for visitors to pass through, but as a body always busy from above. One courtyard led into another. Rooms opened and closed. Passages led to the emperor's residence, to reception chambers, to storerooms, to exhibition spaces, to workrooms where rare objects, paintings, scientific instruments, and mechanical inventions began to find their place beside the authority of the court. In such a place, space was no longer divided only according to the old functions of a palace. It began to be arranged according to a new imagination, one in which each room might at once be a place of courtly life, a stage for prestige, and a chamber for preserving those things an emperor wished to use in defining his own age. The air within the castle must have been very different from what it had been a century earlier. It no longer carried only the scent of wood, fabric, candles, and cold stone. It also carried the smell of oil paint, papers, metal, leather, and countless strange objects from many parts of Europe. In those corridors, one might have encountered an ambassador waiting for an audience, a painter carrying a sketch, a servant quietly transporting a wooden box filled with objects, a secretary holding an armful of documents, or a craftsman summoned to repair an intricate mechanical device. The castle was no longer only a place where power reigned from a distant remove. It became a place where power was in motion, where all kinds of people, objects, and ideas moved through walls that had once been more accustomed to ceremony than to the density of curiosity. The city below may still have awakened to the sound of bells, as it long had done. Vendors still opened their shops. The squares still gradually filled. The Vltava still reflected the light of early day beneath the stone bridges. But above, Prague was learning a new rhythm of life, the rhythm of a capital where art, diplomacy, and knowledge were drawn close together beneath the eye of an emperor. That made Prague Castle no longer merely the highest part of the city in geographical terms. It became the place where ambition was most concentrated, where everything seemed to be gathered in service of a larger idea of empire, not merely powerful, but refined, not merely wealthy, but learned, not merely ruling, but wishing to be remembered as the center of a world expanding in both power and imagination. And perhaps it was precisely there, among the courtyards, reception chambers, and spaces crowded with objects, that Prague truly began to change. Not simply because the emperor was living in the castle, but because from that castle a new way of seeing the city was slowly spreading downward. Prague was no longer merely the guardian of Bohemia's past. It was becoming the place where the empire attempted to imagine its own future. The Met also emphasizes that Rudolph's ambition as a patron of architecture was expressed in his reconstruction and expansion of the castle complex, while he also promoted new buildings in the city. This is very important because it shows that Prague's return as an imperial capital did not happen only within the boundaries of the court. It spread outward. When a place becomes the residential center of an emperor, the entire city must learn to reflect that new status. Facades are seen differently. Squares acquire added functions. Streets may become stages for processions, for diplomacy, for the display of rank. A capital does not merely need places to work. It needs the scenery of power. And Prague, with its sloping terrain, its Vltava, its towers, and its layered skyline, almost already possessed all the conditions needed to become such a stage. But what transformed Prague even more deeply was not only the presence of the emperor, but the kinds of people he drew there. Britannica records that when Rudolf moved his court to Prague, he brought with him patronage for art and science. Prague became associated with names such as Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, along with figures from the world of alchemy such as Edward Kelly. That fact alone is enough to show how profoundly the city changed in character. A place that had once been a medieval urban center of Bohemia now became a focal point where observations of the heavens, experiments with matter, rare collections, and courtly ambitions all pressed in beside one another. In other words, Prague did not simply become a capital of power. It became a capital of concentration, a place where people, objects, and ideas were all drawn inward. For the city's inhabitants, that transformation was likely first felt in very concrete ways. More strangers in the streets, more carriages passing through, greater demand for food, lodging, cloth, candles, furniture, wine, paper, copying services, repair, and transport. Craftsmen could find more clients, merchants could see new opportunity. Householders near the centers of power could understand that their location had just become more valuable. But at the same time, an imperial capital always brings with it its own special sense of instability. Wherever one comes close to power, one also comes close to sudden change, to rumor, to intrigue, to the rise and fall of favor. An invitation to court could change a life. So could a fall from grace when the court arrived. Not only light came with it, shadow came closer as well. Perhaps that is why Prague under Rudolf II possesses such a distinct place in European history. It was not quite like a military capital, nor like a purely commercial city, nor merely a religious center. It was a place where many forms of power were layered together. The power of the throne, the power of symbol, the power of knowledge, and even the power of things not yet fully explained. The city did not lose its essence of stone and mist when it became a capital once again. On the contrary, it was precisely that essence that made its return all the more haunting. A new court did not rise in empty space. It fastened itself to walls already old, to pathways already familiar, to bell towers that had long existed. And for that reason, every change felt at once new and ancient. As though Prague was not greeting an entirely different future, but awakening a possibility that had long been asleep within it. And that is perhaps the truest way to understand part 2 of this story. Prague was not simply chosen as a capital, it was reactivated as one. What Charles IV had once built as a capital on an imperial scale had left behind its framework. Rudolf II stepped into that framework and breathed into it a new content, more discreet, more intellectual, more shadowed, and also stranger, from this point onward. Prague would no longer be only a city of stone bridges, churches, and squares. It would become a city of rooms filled with strange objects, of skies measured with an unprecedented attentiveness, of bells dividing day and night, and of a court where imagination could walk very close beside power. It is here, in the moment when Prague returned as an imperial capital, that the rest of the story truly begins. If, in the previous part, Prague appeared as a capital recovering the rhythm of empire under Rudolf II. Then in this part, the city begins to open another door, narrower, darker, and more difficult to forget. Not the door of the Great Hall, of the square, or of ceremonies visible to all, but the door leading into rooms where small flames burn beneath the bottoms of glass vessels, where metal is heated until it changes color, where formulas are copied by hand under candlelight, and where the people of the late 16th century believed that matter still kept secrets it had not yet agreed to speak aloud. It was precisely in Prague, Britannica tells us, that Habsburg emperors such as Maximilian II and especially Rudolf II became hopeful patrons of the alchemical world, to the point that the city came to be called the metropolis of alchemy. But to understand Prague in that age, we must set aside the overly simple image that modernity so often attaches to alchemy. This is not merely the story of a few lonely men trying to turn lead into gold in hidden cellars. In the context of late 16th century Europe, alchemy stood at the crossing point of metallurgy, medicine, material making, natural philosophy, religious symbolism, esoteric knowledge, and political ambition. Britannica emphasizes that some alchemists focused on making gold, yet others inclined toward forms of alchemy that were more religious, more symbolic, or made no direct claims about gold at all. The Met, meanwhile, notes that early modern alchemy was deeply connected to practical material arts such as color, metal, glass, and craftsmanship, meaning that it did not exist entirely outside the world of experiment and technique. And Prague, almost by fate, was better suited to that world than many other cities. This was already a city of bell towers, of time made public upon civic facades, of stone bridges, churches, castles, symbols, and ceremony. When Rudolf II established his court here and took up long residence in Prague Castle, that castle ceased to be merely the dwelling place of a monarch. According to the official history of Prague Castle, under Rudolf II, the transformation of the castle reached its height. He settled there permanently, turning it into a grand and dignified center of the empire, while also building the northern wing with the Spanish Hall to house his precious collections of art and science. The Prague Castle. Staterooms page likewise confirms that the Spanish Hall and Rudolph Gallery were created in the 16th century precisely to serve Rudolph II's collections. This reveals a very important truth. In Prague, alchemy did not live apart from the court. It lived within the same orbit as collections, works of art, and the imperial longing to gather the world into the field of its own gaze. Try to imagine Prague Castle in those years not as a silent monument, but as a body always in motion. Outside were courtyards, great gates, high towers, reception rooms, and the corridors of power. But somewhere behind those layers of architecture were workshops, workrooms, chambers filled with rare objects, places where art, mechanics, science, and alchemy touched one another. The light there was not like the light of the square. It was lower, redder, more flickering. The smell was different too, not only wood, candles, and cold stone, but heated metal, burning charcoal, oil, leather, paper, ink, and finely ground minerals. In such an atmosphere, alchemy did not appear as some fringe superstition. It appeared as a discipline of hope, the hope that nature might be compelled to reveal a deeper order, the hope that matter might be refined, healed, transformed, or at the very least understood a little more completely beneath the human hand. It was Rudolf II who made that world grow so dense in Prague. He was not the kind of ruler who wanted power proven only through war or law. What remains from his age reveals a man powerfully drawn to what was rare, exquisite, difficult to explain, and to objects that made the court seem almost to be in direct conversation with the secrets of the world. Prague city tourism even describes Rudolf II's generosity and his immense art collection at Prague Castle as an attraction that attracted alchemists like bees to honey, though this is undeniably a vivid turn of phrase. It reflects a reality grounded in fact. Prague truly became a gathering place for figures connected with alchemy, esotericism, astrology, and observational science. Because Rudolf II's court possessed money, prestige, and a patron curious enough to sustain them within that world. The story of Edward Kelly stands almost as the perfect model of the way Prague alchemy always wavers between history and legend. Britannica confirms that Kelly was an English alchemist, companion to John Dee, and that in 1595 he lost his life during an escape attempt after being imprisoned by Rudolf II. Prague city tourism tells the story in greater detail, saying that Kelly and John Dee came to Bohemia in the hope of winning the emperor's favor. Dee was quickly expelled under suspicion of espionage, while Kelly remained, gradually attracting attention at court and becoming known as one of Rudolf II's court alchemists. Though we must clearly distinguish between core historical fact and the later layer of promotional storytelling, the two sources reinforce a very clear framework. Kelly was real. His connection to Rudolf II was real, and the tragic end of his life was real. For that reason, he became one of the most haunting figures in Prague's alchemical age. Around Kelly, countless stories were told with a color almost novelistic in tone. Prague city tourism describes him as a figure of extraordinary powers of persuasion, associated with promises of the philosopher's stone, the elixir of eternal youth, and even the ability to observe things beyond the reach of ordinary sight through a black mirror. Of course, when reading such accounts, one must maintain a necessary distance. Part of them reflects the true atmosphere of the age and the reputation Kelly carefully built around himself. Another part belongs to a later layer of embellishment, thickened by the imagination of subsequent centuries. Yet it is precisely that mixture which makes Kelly such a distinctively Prague figure of Rudolf II's time, a man poised between court and stage, between workshop and rumor, between material experiment and the art of making others believe in what they had not yet seen. Britannica confirms that Kelly was an English alchemist, companion to John Dee, and that he ultimately died after an escape attempt while imprisoned by Rudolf II. That ending alone already gives his life the shape of a dark legend. Perhaps the most important thing is not how accurate each rumor about Kelly may be, but why someone like him could blaze so brightly in Prague's imagination. He did not appear in an empty city. He entered a Prague already accustomed to symbol, ceremony, and chambers crowded with rare and strange things under Rudolf II. All it took was a foreign man from England, linked with John Dee, speaking of the philosopher's stone, of a red substance that could transmute metals, of secret knowledge held by no one else. And suddenly, both court and city began to see him as something more than a mere scholar. He became a figure in whom real ability, performance, personal ambition, and the faith of others all mingled together. He belonged to that class of person whom history finds very difficult to keep in sharp outline, because even while alive, they have already begun helping to write their own legend. We can see that very clearly in the places associated with him. Prague city tourism mentions Faust House, later covered by the legend of Dr. Faust being carried off by the devil through a hole in the roof. The source states plainly that this legend was likely nourished by the fact that some owners of the house had been involved in alchemy and the natural sciences. Among them, Kelly. That means that in Prague, history does not always disappear into myth. Sometimes it merely changes shape. A man once living in that house, once working in an alchemical workshop, once believed to hold the secrets of the material world, that alone was enough for posterity to place over the building a story darker and more Faustian than before. And then, with time, people no longer remembered merely a house once owned by an alchemist. They remembered a house where knowledge had been pushed too close to darkness. Another example lies in Kelly's very connection to John Dee. Dee was a famous English mathematician, astrologer, and occult philosopher, while the British Museum still preserves the obsidian mirror associated with his name, describing it as Dr. Dee's magical mirror, or magical speculum. The very existence of that object is enough to explain why stories of the Black Mirror clung so stubbornly to the world of Dee and Kelly, though we should not confuse a real artifact with every tale woven around it. That mirror is a marvelous example of the kind of object that causes the boundary between science, mysticism, courtly treasure, and the theater of belief to blur. A black obsidian mirror, used as a shoe stone, traveling from the New World into the hands of an Elizabethan intellectual, then appearing within the orbit of stories leading toward Prague. This alone is enough to make an entire age feel as if it were living inside a chronicle where matter and symbol had never yet parted company. And Kelly was not the only case showing how easily Prague could generate legend. Britannica mentions Alexander Seton, a Scottish alchemist who traveled across Europe with widely publicized demonstrations of transmutation before being imprisoned and tortured in Saxony in 1603. A figure like Seton shows that Europe of the period was already familiar with the type of the wandering alchemist, men who performed, promised, and left courts and nobles half curious, half skeptical. Set against such a background, Kelly becomes even easier to understand. He was not merely one strange individual. He belonged to an entire world in which alchemical fame was built from rumor, patronage, artifacts, formulas, and sometimes from appearances almost theatrical in nature before audiences already eager to believe. Prague, with Rudolph II's castle, with its wonder-filled collections, and with its desire to gather knowledge into the center of empire, was simply the ideal soil for such a figure. Perhaps that is why Kelly always appears as a man of many layers, half scholar, half adventurer, half experimenter, half seller of dreams. On one side, he belongs to the very real world of workshops, patronage, and court. On the other, he quickly slips into the realm of rumor, the philosopher's stone, elixirs of immortality, black mirrors, secret manuscripts, formulas known to him alone. And in a city like Prague, where narrow windows, stone corridors, and old houses already seem as if they are always hiding something behind their walls, once such a figure appears, history is almost certain to be covered by a veil of imagination. Not because Prague wishes to invent things, but because Prague itself is the kind of city that always makes one feel that beyond what can be seen. Another layer of meaning still burns quietly, like a small flame beneath the bottom of a glass vessel. And then there is John Dee, no less compelling a figure. He was an English mathematician, astrologer, and occult philosopher, closely tied to the court of Elizabeth I and to countless stories of mysterious manuscripts, angelic language, visionary practice, and ancient knowledge. Prague city tourism says that Dee came with Kelly to Bohemia in the dream of winning Rudolph II's favor, but did not remain for long. Yet that very brief presence seems to suit Prague all the more. He resembles a shadow passing through the city, leaving behind the impression that here every boundary between mathematics, astrology, alchemy, and mysticism was already touching. Names like Dee and Kelly make us understand that Prague of that moment was not merely a place for alchemists in the narrow sense, but a gathering place for a distinct late Renaissance intelligence, an intelligence not yet fully separated from observation, faith, symbol, and the desire to master nature. And yet, the most memorable thing about Prague is not merely its specific individuals, but the way the city itself seems to have begun collecting addresses of legend. A clear example is Faust House, or Mladoda Palace. Prague city tourism is very explicit in stating that the legend linking the house to Dr. Faust, the man who sold his soul to the devil, is in fact a later one, dating chiefly from the Romantic period, and quite possibly arose because some owners of the house had been connected to alchemy and the natural sciences, chief among them Edward Kelly, Rudolph II's court alchemist. This detail is especially valuable because it shows how legends in Prague do not usually rise from nothing. They grow from small historical cores strange enough in themselves, a house where alchemy was practiced, a famous owner associated with formulas and ambition, a city already accustomed to looking at dark windows as places where some hidden thing might be taking place. So what, in fact, did people do in those workshops? The answer is perhaps less magical than the modern imagination might hope, yet in many ways more fascinating. Alchemy in that age could include distillation, heating, dissolving, refining, preparing mineral compounds, testing the properties of metals, studying medicines, or pursuing processes of material transformation that today we would describe in the language of early chemistry. Britannica also notes that many European alchemists later turned toward medicine or more symbolic forms of alchemy. Rather than focusing solely on transmutation, that means that within the same city, beneath the same atmosphere, there may have been one person truly seeking gold, another seeking medicine, another seeking knowledge, and another seeking a position at court by promising all of these things at once. That is precisely what makes Prague special. Here, alchemy was not merely a practice, it was a stage for hope. The emperor's hope that his empire might possess the rarest secrets. The alchemist's hope of patronage, of trust, of rising near to power. The hope of an entire age that still believed the material world had not yet closed itself. That nature might be unlocked by the right formula, the right temperature, the right patience, and perhaps even by a little grace from a higher realm, seen in that light. Prague was not merely a place with laboratories. It was a place where court, workshop, and the imagination of Europe passed through one another every day. And perhaps that is also why this city still keeps its own particular mist around alchemy even now. Not because posterity truly believes that every story of gold or immortality was correct, but because Prague was once real enough to give those stories something to cling to, and beautiful enough that they refused to disappear. A castle where an emperor built the Spanish Hall and Rudolph Gallery for his collections of art and science. A court that genuinely patronized alchemists, figures like Kelly and Dee who truly passed through. A house like Faust House, genuinely bound to the memory of alchemy. All of these things mean that Prague does not need to invent very much in order to seem strange. Its history already carries a vibration astonishingly close to myth. And so, if we wish to remember the Prague of Part 3 through a single image, it is perhaps not the image of gold. Rather, it is the image of a small, steady flame burning in an enclosed room, where someone bends over a glass vessel and believes that matter has not yet spoken its final word. Outside, the bells still ring from the towers. Out there, people still cross the square. Above, the castle still glows like the center of empire. But somewhere behind those thick walls, between laboratory, court, and legend, Prague is nurturing one of Europe's oldest dreams, that this world may be understood more deeply, refined more perfectly, and perhaps, in some rare moment, transformed into something brighter than itself. If, in the previous part, we entered rooms where fire burned beneath the bottoms of glass vessels, where matter was heated as though human beings were trying to force nature to confess its deeper secrets, then now Prague opens in the opposite direction. No longer bent over the furnace, no longer looking into metal, glass, minerals, and the transformations that take place within the reach of the hand. The city now lifts its gaze, and when it does, what appears is not only the night sky, but an entirely different order of the world, broader, colder, more exact, and in a certain way even more overwhelming than the dream of alchemy. It was under the reign of Rudolph II that Prague became a prominent center of the new astronomy. As Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler both entered the orbit of this court, authoritative sources agree that Rudolph II turned Prague into one of the most important places in Europe for early modern astronomy. What makes Prague special is not merely that great astronomers were here. What makes it special is that astronomy entered this city not as a world wholly separate from the one we have just passed through. It did not stand in complete opposition to alchemy, nor was it some sudden victory of modern science over the darkness of mysticism. In Prague, under Rudolph II, these things still stood very close together, within the same court. One might patronize alchemical workshops, collect strange objects, and at the same time support the most precise astronomical observations of the pre-telescopic age. Prague city tourism captures that spirit quite well when it notes that at Rudolph II's court there were, at one and the same time, Kepler, Tycho Brahe, and alchemists promising the elixir of eternal life. This was not a contradiction. It was the true face of the late Renaissance. The sky above Prague, therefore, was not merely a natural dome stretched over the city. It was an extension of courtly ambition, just as the castle held collections, workshops, and galleries. The sky became another realm that power wished to draw into its field of vision. In Rudolph II's eyes, gathering those who could read the movement of the planets, measure the positions of the stars, and calculate the order of the heavens was not merely an intellectual pleasure. It was part of the dream of turning Prague into a center where the world, from matter beneath the furnace to the heavenly bodies above the rooftops, might all be observed, recorded, and to some degree reordered beneath the gaze of empire. Encyclopedia Com likewise emphasizes that Rudolf II's transfer of the capital to Prague made it into a brilliant center of the Renaissance, while the Habsburg dynasty entry states plainly that he transformed Prague into a center of new astronomy. Among the names associated with this layer of sky, Tycho Brahe appears first as a man who carried with him an entire age of observation. Britannica confirms that after leaving Vanum, Tycho settled in Prague in 1599 under the patronage of Rudolf II. This is a very important detail, because Tycho did not arrive in Prague as a passing guest. He came as an astronomer already renowned across Europe, celebrated for his observational instruments and for the extraordinary precision of his measurements of the stars and the motions of the solar system. In other words, when Tycho came to Prague, the city did not merely receive a scholar, it received a man who had spent his life turning the act of looking upward into a discipline demanding rigor, skill, and an almost severe exactness. If we want to picture Tycho in Prague, perhaps we should first forget the monuments and brief biographical lines. We should think instead of a man carrying with him the habits of sky measuring in an age before the telescope. Everything at that time depended on the eye, on mechanical instruments, on constant alignment, on a power of recording in which even a small error could become a significant difference. Tycho did not look at the sky the way a poet looks at the sky. He looked at it as a man who knew that the universe reveals its order only to those patient enough to measure it. And Prague, under Rudolf II's patronage, gave him the place to continue that work. Prague city tourism says that Kepler joined the court in 1600 as Tycho's assistant, and that both men lived in Hradčany. The same source also mentions a house with an observatory added by Jakub Kurz, even if the building itself no longer survives. The detail shows us something more important. Astronomy in Prague did not exist only on paper. It truly had an address, a roof, an actual structure devoted to looking upward into the sky. Beside Tycho stood Johannes Kepler, the man who would make Prague one of the most important cities in the history of Western science. Britannica tells us that in 1600, Tycho invited Kepler to come near Prague to work with him. After Tycho's sudden death in 1601, Kepler quickly succeeded him. Encyclopedia Com likewise confirms that Kepler entered Rudolf II's court in Prague in 1600 and was later appointed Tycho's successor. This was an immense transition, because if Tycho represented the precision of observation before the age of the telescope, then Kepler was the one who would use that very treasury of data to move deeper into the true structure of planetary motion. Prague, therefore, was not merely the place where two great astronomers happened to appear. It was the place where the knowledge of one was passed into the hands of the other, like a flame transferred from one lamp to the next. There is a singular beauty in that moment of transfer. Imagine Prague at the beginning of the 17th century. By day, the city was still itself, stone bridges, squares, church bells, people moving between the old town and the castle district. But at night, when the noise thinned out and only a few windows remained lit, the sky above Prague became another kind of text, dark, vast, cold, yet full of signs for those who knew how to read. Somewhere above, a man like Tycho had spent countless nights patiently recording the positions of the fixed stars and the motions of the planets. Britannica confirms that Tycho settled in Prague in 1599 under Rudolf II's patronage. After already completing most of his vast observing career before then, he died in Prague in 1601, leaving the entirety of his observational data to Kepler. What makes that moment beautiful is not only the presence of two great names in the same city, but the feeling that knowledge was truly being passed from one pair of eyes to another. Tycho was a man of measurement, of observational discipline, of tables and records built from an almost severe patience. Kepler, who came to Prague in 1600 to work with him, entered that world like an heir who did not yet know that he was about to inherit an entire sky of data. Somewhere near Tycho, Kepler was struggling not only with numbers, but with the meaning hidden behind them, the points of light in the sky, if seen merely with the eye, seem silent and distant, but once recorded night after night, year after year, they begin to reveal that the heavens do not move by accident. They have rhythm, they have law, they have a structure that human beings can gradually approach, if only they are persistent enough. Prague was not merely the place where they lived, it was the place from which they looked upward, sharing the same sky, trying together to read the rhythm that the universe had kept hidden from most of humankind. One can imagine intensely cold nights, when Prague's rooftops and bell towers sank into darkness, while above them the sky stretched taut like a gigantic map not yet solved. Below, the city slept in bells and stone. But in a few rare points of light, perhaps in a chamber near the castle, someone still remained awake, bent over records, comparing calculations to the positions of the planets, trying to make the night sky slightly less mysterious. That is what made Prague special. It was not merely the setting for astronomy. It was a city in which the sky, for a brief but decisive span of time, became the most living part of its history. And from nights like those, a new way of seeing the universe began to grow, slowly, but irreversibly. It is precisely for that reason that Part 4 should be felt as a natural extension of Part 3, rather than its complete replacement. If alchemy asked matter what it might become, astronomy asked the sky according to what law it moved. One looked into transformation within the furnace. The other looked into transformation upon the celestial sphere. One hoped to refine, to heal, to transmute. The other hoped to measure, to calculate, to predict. Both shared an ancient faith that Prague seems to have held better than many other places, that the world is not meaningless chaos, but has order, and that this order can gradually reveal itself to those who know how to observe with patience. That is why Rudolf II's simultaneous patronage of alchemy and astronomy was not as strange as the modern eye often imagines. It merely shows that he belonged wholly to his own age. Prague also possesses one beautiful detail that anchors this feeling to a specific place. Prague City Tourism notes that Queen Anne's summer palace was frequently used by Rudolf II, and that he established an astronomical observatory on its first floor. Among those who visited it was Tycho Brahe. That detail allows us to picture things more clearly. The sky of Prague was not observed merely in the abstract. It had real places, real architecture, real windows and terraces from which people lifted their gaze upward. This city was already full of towers, bells, and public astronomical clocks. Now, it also held spaces where stargazing became a serious labor of the court. Prague, therefore, did not merely hear time through bells. It also began to reckon time and space through the movements of the planets. After Tycho's death in Prague in 1601, the story did not stop, but moved still further. Britannica emphasizes that Tycho died in Prague, while Kepler continued his work afterward. The data Tycho gathered would later be used by Kepler for the Rudolphine tables, published in 1627. Britannica describes them as a set of planetary tables and a star catalogue based chiefly on Tycho's observations, possessing extraordinarily high accuracy for the pre-telescopic period, including the positions of 1,005 stars and tables used to determine the positions of the planets. Though the publication appeared after the high point of Rudolf II's age, its spirit was still Prague, a work in which observation, court, imperial title, and the many years of patience of those who studied the heavens crystallized into a map of the sky. That is why Prague under Rudolf II cannot be remembered only as the city of alchemy or of wonder-filled collections. It must also be remembered as a city that helped change the way human beings looked at the sky. Not through the telescope, as in the century that followed, but through an immense change of mind from a sky read chiefly as a field of symbolic signs to a sky that could be measured with unprecedented accuracy. The Bohemia entry on encyclopedia.com also notes that under Rudolf II, Prague was famous as a center of late Renaissance science. Specialized workshops produced precision instruments for astronomers such as Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. This is an especially memorable detail, because it shows that even the act of looking at the stars did not happen alone. It required craftsmen, instruments, printers, and a city with an infrastructure dense enough for new knowledge to live. And so, when night falls over Prague in this part 4, one can feel that the city is living beneath two skies at once. One sky of older belief, of symbol, of omens that Europe had been accustomed to reading for many centuries, and another sky, still the very same sky, but now beginning to be drawn into the net of measurements, calculations, star catalogs, and the precision brought by Tycho and then Kepler. Rudolf II likely did not see that separation in the way we do now. To him, a city containing both alchemists and astronomers was no paradox. It was glory. It meant that Prague was a place where human beings dared to question both earth and heaven, dared to question the matter beneath the hand and the stars above. And that is precisely what made Prague one of the strangest capitals in Europe, a place where, between Gothic streets, beneath the bells, and above the stone rooftops, the history of the universe was once rewritten one number at a time. Prague is never completely silent, even when night has fallen deep, when the square has thinned of people, when only a scattering of windows still remain lit, and the surface of the Vltava holds the blackness of water beneath the cold sky. This city still retains a vibration of its own, a gust of wind slipping through a narrow passage, a footstep ringing out upon stone, and then, from somewhere above, a bell falling down, slow, deep, lingering, as though time itself has just found a voice. That is what makes Prague different. Here, time does not merely pass, it resounds, It is hung from towers, released into squares, sent across rooftops and stone walls, so that the whole city may hear it. And because of that, if we wish to understand Prague in the age of alchemists, astronomers, and Gothic streets, we cannot merely look at it, we must listen to it. Imagine a very early morning. The light has only just touched the tops of the towers, while the road below still holds some gray chill of the night not yet gone. The Vltava lies dark and still, like a strip of dim metal between the two banks of the city, on Charles Bridge, whose construction began in 1357 under Charles IV and was completed in the early 15th century. The sandstone surface still carries the dampness of the morning mist. There are not yet many people crossing. A few footsteps ring out clean and firm, sounding louder than usual because the world around them is still sparse with human noise. The towers at either end of the bridge seem to hold the sound longer so that it does not vanish at once, but lingers with its own peculiar echo in such a space. All it takes is the first peal of a bell, and the whole city seems at once to find its rhythm, no longer merely stone, water, rooftops, and mist. It becomes a body just awakened. In a city like Prague, the sound of bells is not merely background, it is a signal. It divides the day into intervals with names, with order, with feeling. A morning peal is not like noon. In the imagination, morning bells usually ring clearer, more slenderly, as though the cold air of dawn carries the sound farther across rooftops still wet with mist. It falls into the square when the shops have not yet fully opened, when the first footsteps are still sparse, when the city has not yet truly filled with voices and movement. And so each morning chime sounds as though it is waking not only human beings, but the stone itself, the windows, the narrow streets that still hold the remnants of darkness in the cracks of their walls. A bell at noon is different again. It is fuller, rounder, as if the sound now strikes a city that has fully awakened. It passes through squares crowded with people, through wagons, through shouted exchanges, through doors opening and closing without cease. The noon bell no longer feels solitary. It sounds like a marker in the current of the day, a metallic accent set down in its densest hour. It does not merely ring out into the air, but rebounds from the facades of buildings, strikes back from the stone walls, then overlaps with itself into a deeper, thicker resonance. In a city like Prague, where stone and towers hold sound longer, the noon bell must have made it feel as though the air itself were vibrating very slightly. The bells of late afternoon carry yet another tone. When the shadows of the walls have stretched across the square, when the light has grown lower and more golden, the bell no longer sounds as though it is beginning something. It sounds as though it is closing a portion of the day. Its sound now seems softer, longer, more settled, in harmony with the light of evening. It passes over rooftops that no longer blaze, through windows beginning to hold their interior lamplight, through street corners where the chill is returning. In Prague, the evening bell surely did not merely mark the hour. It also made one feel that time itself was leaning downward, as though the city were slowing, little by little, beneath those familiar peals. And then there are the bells of the night. These are perhaps the most distinct of all. They do not merely mark the hour, they mark emptiness, as voices in the streets diminish, as the square grows wider because fewer people cross it. As the wind between the narrow streets becomes more audible than in daytime, the night bell no longer dissolves into life. It stands alone. Each stroke falls more clearly, more deeply, more coldly. The silence between the tolls becomes part of the sound itself. It is that silence which makes the listener feel that the city has grown wider, higher, and a little lonelier, yet at the same time, it draws the listener closer to oneself. In the dark of night, a bell from above can make all of Prague seem to recede, until only a single person remains listening. A dark sky overhead, cold stone beneath the feet, and the feeling that time has just spoken aloud within the emptiness of the night. In a world not yet crowded with engines, sirens, motors, and electronic signals pressing against one another, bells were not ornaments of the air. They were the way time entered shared life. They announced, they coordinated, they gathered people living in different quarters of the city into one invisible rhythm. They gave the morning its beginning, noon its center, evening its downward tilt, and night its depth. In Prague, that sound must have been even more distinct because it always passed through an architecture that knew how to hold an echo, through tall towers, through stone walls, through arches, through narrow streets where sound did not vanish at once but lingered a little longer, as though the city itself did not wish to release it too quickly. And because of that, each peal of a bell was not simply a sound. It was a sign released from above, a way for the city to remind itself where the day had gone, that human beings were still living together within a rhythm larger than their individual footsteps, that whether one stood on a bridge, in a square, behind a shop counter, in a church, or behind the wooden door of one's own house, no one in Prague lived entirely outside the shared time of the city. The bell did not remind them of that in words, but in metal, in vibration, in resonance lingering through the cold air, a sound that belonged at once to the earth and seemed to fall from the sky. At the center of that rhythm stood the old town hall. The building was established in 1338 as the seat of government for the old town. And that is not merely an administrative detail. It means that, from very early on, Prague possessed a place where urban authority presented itself before the community, not in the form of a palace or a great cathedral, but in the form of a public building in the heart of the city. The oldest part of the structure includes the southern wing, the Gothic tower, the projecting chapel, and the famous astronomical clock known as the Horloge. This makes the Old Town Hall far more unusual than an ordinary city hall. It does not merely govern the city. It sends forth signals about the city. It does not merely contain documents, council chambers, and public ceremonies. It stands there as the place where Prague sees and hears itself. If one stands in Old Town Square at some striking hour, one can begin to understand why the horloge became such a powerful symbol. The oldest part of this astronomical clock dates from 1410, and according to official Prague sources, it is the oldest working astrolabe of its kind in the world, every hour from 8 in the morning until 11 at night. The 12 apostles appear in the 2 windows above the clock. But what makes the horloge so compelling is not only its age or its mechanical complexity. What matters more is that in Prague, time is placed openly upon the facade of a public building. It does not pass silently within each individual mind. It steps out into the square, it takes on form, motion, rhythm, sound, the anticipation of a crowd, and the feeling of a ritual repeated. An hour does not arrive merely because the hands of a clock have moved. It arrives as a small event witnessed by the city together. And it is precisely here that Prague reveals one of its deepest peculiarities. This is a city that does not fully separate the practical from the symbolic. A clock can at once tell the hour, display the movements of the heavens, serve as a mechanical spectacle, and become a public image at which residents and strangers alike lift their eyes. A city hall can be both a place of administration and a place where time is made public. Such things make Prague not merely a city that lives in time, it lives with time, here. The hours are not something shut away in private life. They are suspended high, placed in the middle of the square, so that all may hear them, see them, and arrange their lives according to a rhythm that has been made civic. But Prague does not have only one center of sound, from many directions. The city is awakened by its towers and churches. If the old town hall is where time is brought into the midst of urban life, then St. Vitus Cathedral in the Castle District brings another dimension of sound. Deeper, heavier, more closely tied to power and to the sacred. Official Prague sources say that in the great bell tower of the cathedral hangs the bell Sigismund, cast in 1549 by Tomáš Jaroš, the largest bell in Czechia, with a diameter of just under 256 centimeters, a height of 203 centimeters, and an estimated weight of 16.5 tons. The numbers alone are enough to suggest the material gravity of sound in Prague. The bells here are not merely abstract signals sounding from somewhere high above. They are created from real metal, real mass, real bell-founding craftsmanship, and the real trembling of the air around the city. Let us linger with that image a little longer. A great bell such as Sigismund does not simply produce sound. It imposes its presence upon space. When it rings, the stone walls cease to be mere silent background. They become planes of response. The air between the rooftops ceases to be empty space. It becomes a conductor. At such a moment, the sound is not light. It has sensory weight. It passes through the listener's body, across the face of the square, through half-open windows into small courtyards, up the sloping roads leading toward the castle, in a city built of stone. The sound of bells does not merely ring, it rebounds, it returns. It leaves behind a residue of vibration, such that even several seconds after the primary sound has passed, one still feels in the chest a very slight trembling. Perhaps that is why bells in Prague always carried more than one meaning. They were ritual, but also organization. They were a call to church, but also a mechanism for dividing the day. They could be comfort, but they could also be warning. They might accompany festivity, but they could also accompany anxiety. In old European cities, bells once signaled fire, danger, the hour, liturgy, death, and moments of great importance. Prague, with its number of towers, with its rising and falling terrain, with the distances between its quarters, and with its habit of living among architecture that rises upward, must have been especially sensitive to such acoustic organization. Here, bells did not speak only to one parish. They spoke to the entire urban landscape. And perhaps the loveliest thing lies in the fact that this sound always passes through a city already filled with material memory. Bell sounds do not fall upon neutral surfaces. They pass over Gothic walls, over red roof tiles faded by many winters, over the statues of saints upon the bridge, over towers with narrow windows like slits cut into time itself for that reason. Bells in Prague are never merely pure sound. They almost always touch symbol. A late afternoon bell may make the golden light upon a stone wall seem stiller. A night bell may deepen the darkness between the rooftops. An early morning bell may make the mist over the river feel as though it has just been named. Here, sound and image seem never to have wholly separated from one another. Even Prague's quietest moments are not truly silent. Think of a narrow street near dusk. Fewer people are passing now. The stone beneath the feet grows cooler. Perhaps from one window a small line of light falls outward. Perhaps farther away one hears the sound of a wooden door closing. The wind moving between two walls is not strong, but enough to stir the air, and then from above, from somewhere the eye cannot immediately find, a bell rings down. It passes straight through that quiet, not breaking it but shaping it. It is in moments like these that Prague appears most clearly as a city of sound. Not noisy, not chaotic, but rhythmic, layered, deep, a place where time seems not merely counted, but voiced. If one stands longer in the square, looking up at the old town hall, at the line of towers against the sky, and then thinks of the great bells in the castle district, one begins to feel that Prague possesses a very strange quality. It makes time seem at once public and sacred. Public, because the hours are made visible upon the horloge, heard in the streets, shared by every resident. Sacred, because that sound always descends from above, always belongs to the tower, the church, the sky, to something beyond the life of any one individual. It is that combination that makes Prague different. It is not merely a city that knows how to organize time. It is a city that knows how to ritualize time. And perhaps that is why, if one had to retain a single image for this chapter, it would not be the image of one clock or one bell in particular. It would be the image of the whole city at a striking hour. The square slightly cold, the stone pale, people passing, slowing unconsciously, the rooftop still beneath the sky, and then from the high tower, time beginning to sound, not in books, not in the mind, but in the air, in the stone, in the memory of a city that has lived too long, with bells to separate itself from them. In that sense, Prague is not merely a city of pointed towers and a beautiful skyline. It is a city where one can hear time passing. Prague may be remembered for its castle, for its bells, for the emperor's galleries, or for the great names of astronomy and alchemy. But if one wishes to touch the most enduring soul of this city, perhaps one must return to something lower, nearer, more ordinary, its streets, not the square at the hour of ceremony, not the grand hall of the court, but the stone-paved paths, the turns between two narrow walls, the wooden doors opening in the morning, the dark stairways rising to the upper floors, the inner courtyards that no one can fully see from the street outside. It is there, in that layer of Prague closest to the ground, that the city has lived the longest life of all. UNESCO describes the historic center of Prague as an urban whole that developed from the 11th to the 18th century, where the Old Town, Lesser Town, and New Town together reveal the city's great architectural and cultural influence from the Middle Ages onward. That means Prague does not consist merely of isolated monuments. It possesses an entire urban body that has been lived in, walked through, traded in, argued in, prayed in, and grown old across many centuries. Let us begin with a morning in the Old Town. Light does not enter this place evenly. Some walls catch the early sun, while other stretches of street hold their chill much longer because the houses stand tall and close enough to keep them in shadow. The stone underfoot may still be damp. A door opens slightly. A shopkeeper arranges something out on the threshold. A window on an upper floor lights up. And then someone pours water into the gutter or throws open a wooden shutter to let the air of the new day into the house. In streets such as these, Prague does not present itself as a panorama. It appears in fragments, in corners, in surfaces, in short measures of footsteps. This is a city that compels one to read it as one would read a text written in turns and bends. Only when one turns another corner does a courtyard suddenly open, a tower rise into view, or a facade abruptly catch the light and change its tone entirely. Perhaps that is also why daily life in Prague must always have felt a little more private, a little closer to the wall, and more sheltered by architecture than in many other open cities. What makes Prague special is not merely that its old streets still survive, but that the parts of the city fit together into a living logic. The Old Town is the long-standing civic and commercial center, where the squares, city hall, churches, shops, and moving currents of people create the sense that this is the part of the city that must always wake a little earlier to begin the day's rhythm. The Lesser Town, on the other side of the river beneath the castle, carries a different tone, closer to power, closer to ceremonial roots, and always living beneath the very real shadow of Prague Castle above, and the New Town, laid out by Charles IV in a deliberate expansion to the south and east in the 14th century, shows that this city did not simply grow by chance, but was once thought through, organized, imagined as an urban place with a future. In other words, Prague is not a random cluster of houses gathered around a castle. It is a city shaped by major historical decisions. Yet its true life still flows through very small things, going from home to market, from bridge to square, from workshop to church, from a dark alley into a brighter street. The city, therefore, has both the skeleton of power and the bloodstream of everyday labor. And it is precisely that living logic that makes Prague feel unlike many other places. Here, each part of the city seems to keep its own role without ever being truly separated from the rest. The Old Town could not live without the streams of people and goods crossing the river. The Lesser Town could not be merely the district beneath the castle if it were not for the routes leading upward to the castle and outward to the square. The New Town, though broader and somewhat more open in its planning, still had to draw its rhythm from the older centers in order to form one united body with them. Prague, then, is not merely a collection of districts with different names. It is an urban organism in which the movement between its parts is no less important than the parts themselves. People lived Prague by passing through it, by crossing from one quarter to another, by repeating familiar routes so often that even the stone beneath their feet seems to have remembered. Within that rhythm of life, Charles Bridge is not merely the most beautiful bridge in the city, it is part of the everyday. Official Prague sources state that this stone bridge was begun in 1357 to replace Judith Bridge, which had been destroyed by flood, and completed in 1402 for many centuries. It was the most important crossing over the Vltava in Prague, linking the castle and the lesser town with the old town. Yet the bridge's true significance may lie not in the year it was built or in its architectural beauty, but in the very simple fact that countless people had to cross it every day. When people look at the bridge today, they often see statues, river, skyline. But if we place ourselves in the early modern period, we should see more than that. Porters carrying goods, riders on horseback, messengers, clergy, craftsmen, street vendors, pedestrians mingling together upon the sandstone surface. One man hurrying because he carries news, another pausing for a moment to look at the water, a small group pressing close together to avoid the wind from the river, a slow wagon of goods forcing those around it to move aside, in that sense. The bridge is not merely a connection between two banks. It is the place where different rhythms of life are made to move beside one another within the same space. Wind rises from the river. The water below changes color with the hours of the day. Morning may carry a cold gray tone, almost like steel beneath the thin mist. By noon, the surface brightens, reflecting sky and the stone of the bridge. Toward evening, the river begins to hold more darkness, while the railings and the bridge deck catch the slanting light in such a way that the entire path seems older, quieter. And on the bridge, every layer of the city passes by the others, the rich and the poor, those of the court and those of the market streets, those who cross merely to arrive somewhere else, and those for whom crossing is itself the work they do. The bridge does not simply take people from one bank to another. It forces them to share one path, to hear the same river wind, to tread the same surface of stone worn smooth by innumerable footsteps before them. Perhaps that is why Charles Bridge bears a meaning far deeper than that of a work of transport. It makes Prague feel like a unified city. Not unified because all its parts are alike, but because all its parts must reach toward one another through connectors such as this. Upon that bridge, power comes down from the castle into the city, while the rhythm of market life moves upward toward the castle. Ceremonial processions may pass along the very route where porters still walk each day. Great figures of history may once have stepped upon the same stones that anonymous citizens wore down beneath their heels. And that is precisely what makes Prague so special. Here, the grand and the ordinary are not always kept far apart. They often meet upon the same road, the same bridge, in the same motion across the river. At either end of the bridge, the towers do not merely provide scenery, they frame movement. The Old Town Bridge Tower and the Lesser Town Bridge Towers make the crossing feel like passage through the gates of a ritual repeated every day. Official Prague sources describe the Lesser Town Bridge Towers as two towers of differing styles, joined by a gate, forming the entrance into the Lesser Town from Charles Bridge. That means that in Prague's daily life, even an ordinary act such as crossing the river is never entirely ordinary. It takes place beneath architectural masses that know how to make an impression. People do not merely pass through, they pass amid symbols. And when that is repeated over many generations, daily rhythm itself begins to take on a ritual quality, even if the inhabitants no longer consciously perceive it. Prague is that kind of city. Even the ordinary takes place within a theater of stone. Leaving the bridge and moving deeper into the city, one begins to encounter the life of occupations, A great city in the late 16th and early 17th centuries could not exist by nobles, clergy, and scholars alone. It needed builders, carpenters, carriers, leather workers, cloth sellers, food sellers, paper makers, printers, goldsmiths, brewers, metal founders, locksmiths, servants, clerks. Though the sources we have here do not give us detailed statistics for each street in Rudolf II's Prague. The wider context of late medieval and Renaissance European urban life shows that guilds played a major role in the economic and social life of the city. Those who practiced trades did not merely produce goods, they also created rhythms of life, opening hours, characteristic smells, the sounds of work, and the distinctive face of each street. In Prague, this must have been felt even more strongly because the city lay on trade routes and developed vigorously under Charles IV as a political, economic, and cultural center. Imagine a street where small workshops open directly onto the road, not large industrial workshops, but narrow, deep spaces, wide enough at the front for light to enter. While farther back, they grow darker and denser with the smell of labor. One man is polishing metal. Another is cutting leather upon a wooden table. From a shop across the street may drift the scent of fresh bread, while from another corner comes the smell of wax, cloth, shaved wood, or that faint sourness of a place where damp goods are stored. Prague is not merely a city to be looked at. It must also have been a city full of smells and surfaces: cold stone, old wood, coarse fabric, metal, kitchen smoke, human breath, the damp scent rising from the river and from inner courtyards that receive too little sun. All of this makes daily life anything but background. As posterity sometimes imagines it, it is dense, close, busy, and always leaves traces upon the air. A very important part of that life lay in the houses themselves. In cities like Prague, not everyone lived in separate houses, clearly divided and full of light. Many street-front houses may have looked dignified from the outside. Yet the life within could be arranged vertically: lower floors near the street for trade or receiving visitors, upper floors for the family, apprentices, servants, storage. Behind them there might be an inner yard, stairways, a well, a small stable, or an auxiliary workspace. Old urban architecture made life happen in greater proximity than modern life does. Sound passed through more easily. Smells traveled faster. One family's story might leak into another family's corridor from an upper window. One could look down upon the rhythm of the street as though watching a stage that repeated itself endlessly. Goods passing by, strangers pausing, children running downstairs only to be called back. The sounds of shoes, voices, doors opening and shutting. In such a city, privacy exists, but it is always negotiating with the density of community. And then there is the square, where separate streams of life must meet. Old Town Square is not merely one of Prague's beautiful places. It is the place where the ordinary suddenly becomes collective. Buying and watching intertwine there. People come not only to exchange goods, but to learn what state the city is in, whether it is crowded or empty, what new rumor is abroad, where a group has gathered, whether the weather is tending toward brightness or chill, and what face of urban authority is appearing today in the tower, the clock, the church, the facades. The square, therefore, is not simply open space. It is the place where Prague sees itself most clearly. From it, the streets spread outward again, carrying fragments of shared life back into the more private faces of the city. If one goes down into the lesser town, the feeling may change somewhat beneath the walls of the castle district. That part of the city stands in closer relation to the court, to those moving along the royal route, and to the ever-present shadow of the castle above. Official sources on Powdergate Tower note that it marks the starting point of the coronation or royal route leading to Prague Castle. While Charles Bridge forms a major link in that route, that means there were roads in Prague that served not only daily life, but were also elevated into routes of royal ceremony. Yet what is most interesting is that even when a route carried the meaning of coronation, most of the time it was still an ordinary street, where shoes wore down the stone, where people went to work, to market, carried goods, took shelter from the rain, stopped to speak, and watched a grand procession as some rare interruption in a familiar rhythm. In Prague, ceremony and ordinary life are not separated too far from one another. They share the same road. Another layer of Prague's life lies in the diversity of its communities. Encyclopedia Com notes that Prague possessed the oldest Jewish community in Bohemia and one of the oldest in Europe, recorded from around 970. That fact alone shows that Prague was never a city of a single voice, a single social layer, or a single memory. It was a place where many communities lived beside one another, traded, worshipped, and left their mark upon the urban fabric in such a city. The streets differ not only by occupation or architectural form, they also differ by habit, rhythm of life, networks of acquaintance, and the layers of memory each group carries with it. That makes Prague something deeper than a Gothic scene. It is a many-layered life stacked one upon another within the same frame of stone. If one keeps walking, by the end of the day, Prague changes its voice again. Light lowers itself upon the walls. Narrow alleys darken more quickly than the square. The stone bridge keeps a little of the evening glow upon its railings before sinking into colder tones. Shops close one by one. The sounds of daytime labor diminish. Yet it is precisely then that the city seems to reveal its Gothic side more clearly. Not Gothic as a stylistic label in an art history book, but as a lived sensation, the height of walls, the shadow of towers, streets that do not open straight, but bend through layers of light and darkness. The feeling that human beings are always slightly smaller than the stone around them. Prague in the evening must be the place where one feels most clearly that one is living in a city built to endure longer than a human life. And perhaps that is what silently shapes daily rhythm as well. When living among stones too old and too long-lasting, people tend to walk a little more slowly, look upward a little more often, and feel time not only as calendar days, but as something settled into the very surfaces of the streets. That is why part 6 of this story should not be told merely as daily life, in the form of a list of activities. It must be felt as a walk through Prague, across the bridge, through the tower gates, through narrow streets, across squares, along rows of houses pressed against the road, among people without names in the great chronicles, yet the very people who truly made the city exist from one day to the next. If emperors may leave, if scholars may come and vanish, if collections may be scattered, then it is ordinary footsteps that keep Prague continuously alive. UNESCO calls this entire historic center a complex built and shaped across many centuries. Yet only when we imagine people moving through it do we grasp the full meaning of that. The city was not merely built, it was lived. And so, if one had to retain one image for this chapter, it would perhaps not be a great view from above. It would be a somewhat narrow stone street at the end of the afternoon. An old facade catching the last golden light of day. A shop being closed up. A pedestrian turning into a dark gate, farther away. The sound of another footstep on the road, and above all of it, a Gothic tower standing motionless as though it has stood there longer than the memory of anyone still alive. In the deepest sense, Prague is not merely a city of grand symbols. It is a city of small things repeated long enough to become history. Opening a door, closing a door, crossing a bridge, returning home, carrying goods, looking at the sky, hearing the bells, and continuing to live beneath old stone walls from one day to the next. It is in that enduring repetition that Prague's daily life becomes its most beautiful thing. Not magnificent, not loud, but deep, solid, and almost impossible to separate from the Gothic soul of the city. There are courts that want the world to serve them through taxes, through armies, through loyalty, but there are also courts that want more than that. They want the world to be present before their eyes, to be brought in, rearranged, placed under light, labeled, displayed, admired, and in doing so made part of their authority. Prague under Rudolf II was such a place. If earlier the city had already been a place of alchemical furnaces, of skies being measured, of bell towers and Gothic streets dense with life, then in this part, Prague appears as a place with yet another ambition, to gather the world into the rooms of empire. Official Prague castle sources confirm that in the 16th century, two great spaces, the Spanish Hall and the Rudolph Gallery, were created to serve the collections of Emperor Rudolph II. Prague EU also states that under his reign. The castle once again became a cultural and scientific center of Europe, with new spaces dedicated specifically to those collections. That is very important, because it shows that collecting in Prague was not some minor pastime of a king with refined taste. It was part of an imperial project. When Rudolf II moved his court to Prague in 1583, he did not merely transfer his residence. He also brought here a very particular kind of political and cultural imagination. Empire was built not only by the power to rule, but by the ability to become the center of knowledge, of art, of rare objects, of wonders that others would have to travel far, pay dearly, or hold very high rank to see. The Met notes that Rudolf amassed a collection of paintings numbering in the thousands, including Italian works by Veronese, Correggio, and Leonardo da Vinci, as well as northern masters such as Dürer and Bruegel the Elder. A collection such as that speaks not only of personal taste. It says that Prague had become the place where empire wished to narrate itself through what it could attract and keep. Try to imagine Prague Castle in that period, not only as the residence of the emperor, but as a body thickening with objects, behind the courtyards, beyond the great gates and stone corridors, were spaces where paintings, mechanical clocks, minerals, gemstones, sculptures, scientific instruments, goldsmith works, strange artifacts, and objects brought in from many parts of Europe coexisted side by side. The air in those rooms must have been utterly different from the air outside in the streets. Less wind, less road dust, a denser scent of wax, wood, leather, metal, and oil paint. The light likely entered more selectively, not spilling everywhere, but falling upon individual surfaces, frames, panes of glass, and objects that made the eye linger longer than usual in such a place. One no longer had the feeling of standing among things. One stood within a selected world, a world cut out from the ordinary flow of life and brought into the space of the court so that it could be seen as proof that the emperor possessed not only power, but rarity. That is the very logic of the Kunstkammer and Wunderkammer, the art chambers and wonder rooms characteristic of European courts in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Met once described this collecting culture as a wave sweeping through the great courts, among which one of the most spectacular Kunstkammern was established by Rudolf II at Hradčin Palace in Prague. What made this mode of collecting so distinctive was that it did not divide the world along rigid boundaries the way modern museums later would. A painting might stand beside a mechanical clock. A goldsmith's work might sit beside a rare mineral. An object could be at once art, machinery, evidence of technical craftsmanship, and a thing that provoked astonishment. To us today, such an arrangement may appear disorderly. But in Rudolf II's world, it reflected a far greater ambition to reduce the universe into a room one could walk around inside. So this story is not merely a chapter about collections. It is a chapter about the way an empire imagined itself. An empire like the Habsburg realm under Rudolf II could not control everything with its own hands. It could not directly touch every land, keep every talent at its side, or compel every creative center of Europe to move bodily to Prague. But it could create a powerful illusion that the most significant things in the world were all gradually finding their way toward its center. Rudolf II truly accumulated a vast collection of paintings, with thousands of works by Italian and Northern masters, while Prague Castle reserved spaces such as the Spanish Hall and the Rudolph Gallery for those collections. That is precisely what made collecting a tool of imperial imagination. An Italian painter may not have lived in Prague, but his work could be there. A rare mineral may not have been born in Bohemia, but it could lie in the emperor's display cabinet. A finely crafted scientific instrument may have been made elsewhere, yet ultimately be placed within the same sequence of viewing as paintings, sculpture, goldsmith works, and rare objects. When things that once belonged to places far removed from one another were placed together within a single space, distance began to lose its former shape. What was remote no longer remained beyond reach, but became something present in the corridors of the castle itself. One entering those rooms did not need to cross seas, scale mountains, or pass through many courts in order to feel the vastness of the world. One needed only to move from one room to the next. And it is here that Rudolf II's ambition becomes unmistakably clear. He did not want Prague to be merely the place where people came to seek political favor or attend court ceremony. He wanted this city to become a place where a person might feel that all of Europe, even the known world of that time, had been reduced into a chain of wonders lying within the emperor's sight. Such a collection did not merely display wealth. It created the feeling that the center of empire was also the center of knowledge, of beauty, of rarity, and of objects that the rest of the world had to spend immense effort to create, preserve, or gain access to. That, too, is the spirit of the Kunstkammer, not simply a repository of precious things, but a miniature model of the world, where artistic, natural, mechanical, and strange objects coexist within a new order. Perhaps that is why, moving through such spaces, one did not merely see individual objects, one saw an idea, the idea that power could be expressed not only through armies or territory, but through the ability to draw toward the center the most astonishing things of all. An empire strong enough does not merely command, it causes the most beautiful, the rarest, the most exquisite, and the most mysterious things to become present before it. And in that atmosphere, Prague ceased to be merely a capital. It became a stage upon which the whole world seemed to have been invited, not to live there, but to be seen, arranged, and retold in the empire's own way. This also gave Rudolf II's collections a very particular charm. They were not lifeless accumulations. They were a kind of rewriting of the world through objects. A corridor could stand in for a map. A gallery could stand in for many borders. A display cabinet could make the strange feel near. And what lay very far away becomes something resting directly beneath the light of the court, in that sense. Collecting did not merely turn distance into presence. It also turned that very presence into a declaration that this empire, at least in its own imagination, was vast enough to contain the entire world within its rooms. Yet if we speak only of power, that is still not enough to understand why Prague under Rudolf II was so compelling. For those collections were not intended merely for display. They also reflected a profound faith of the age, that the world was a network of signs, and that human beings could read the world better if they placed objects beside one another, if they looked at them not merely as things for use, but as clues. A mechanical clock did not simply tell the hour. It was also evidence of order, of mathematics, of mechanics. A crystal was not merely beautiful. It also suggested the geometric perfection that nature hid within the earth. A mythological painting was not merely an image. It was also the way history, imagination, and power clothed themselves in a symbolic skin. For that reason, Rudolf II's collection should not be imagined as a storehouse of treasures. It was more like an attempt to construct a map of the visible and wondrous world. There is one beautiful detail that helps us picture this more clearly. The Met once recorded that in Prague, Rudolf II displayed his most impressive objets d'art upon a long table set in the middle of a vaulted room in Hradčany Castle. The detail may be small, but it is richly evocative. It shows that precious objects were not necessarily hidden away. They could be laid out as the center of a deliberate act of looking, not randomly, not piled up, but arranged like a sequence of wonders along which the eye was meant to travel. Such a long table almost turned admiration itself into a ritual. One did not simply look at things. One walked among objects selected to impress, to awaken astonishment, to prove that this court knew how to recognize rarity, could purchase it, keep it, and present it with an almost theatrical confidence. That world must have suited Rudolf II's nature perfectly. He was not the kind of monarch who wanted power to appear only through ranks of soldiers or rigid ceremony. The places where he left his strongest mark seemed to be those where power stood close to beauty, strangeness, and the difficult to explain. That is why, in Prague, art did not stand very far from alchemy. nor scientific objects very far from display objects within the same city. One could hear of alchemical workshops, know that there were men measuring the sky with unprecedented precision, and at the same time see the court gathering paintings, artifacts, clocks, and precious objects into a single system. This was not confusion. It was a world view, a world in which everything could be drawn back toward the emperor's center as different faces of the same universe. Prague, therefore, was not merely a city where objects were housed. It was a city where objects were narrated. Every precious item in a Kunstkammer almost always came with a story: where it came from, who made it, how difficult it was to obtain, how strange it was, where its refinement lay, and above all, why it deserved to stand within the emperor's line of sight. A court such as Rudolf II's lived not only by objects, but by its ability to build around them an atmosphere of rarity. That is what made such collections so different from a warehouse. A warehouse contains what is useful. An imperial collection contains what is meaningful. It makes the viewer believe that if one passes through enough rooms, enough cabinets, enough paintings and strange objects, one will begin to see not merely the taste of an individual, but the spiritual ambition of an age. And it is here too, in these rooms overflowing with beauty and rarity, that one begins to see a slightly sorrowful truth. The greatest collections almost never remain forever in the place that gave them birth. They are moved, dispersed, plundered, reclassified by later ages. Prague Castle Picture Gallery states that after Rudolf II died in 1612, his successor Matthias gradually moved the collection to Vienna. What remained in Prague was later taken by Swedish forces during the 30 Years' War. The same source says that Rudolf once owned about 3,000 paintings, yet scarcely very many of them remain there now. In other words, most of the world he tried to gather into Prague ultimately dissolved away from Prague again. That truth does not make the story any less splendid. It only makes it more fragile. An empire may believe it has gathered the world, but time, war, and succession always find ways of undoing what once seemed most secure. And yet, the strange thing is that even when most of the objects no longer remain in their original places, the memory of that collection still helps make Prague what it is: the National Gallery. Prague states clearly that its collection of old masters contains many works from Rudolf II's legendary Kunstkammer, and that this forms part of a historical core of more than 4 centuries of collecting in Bohemia. Prague Castle Picture Gallery also notes that the painting collection at the castle today, with around 4,000 works, has deep origins in the early 17th century and is the oldest painting collection continuously preserved in the Czech Republic. That means that, although the original Kunstkammer was broken apart, Prague still carries its legacy forward in institutional memory, in museums, in galleries, and most importantly, in the image the city retains of itself, a center where the court once tried to turn collecting into a way of understanding the world. Perhaps that is the most beautiful thing about this chapter. It shows us that empire dreams not only through territory, it dreams through objects as well, through paintings, clocks, gemstones, goldsmith works, strange artifacts, and galleries in which the human eye is guided toward astonishment. In a city like Prague, that dream fits all the more naturally because the place already possessed towers, bridges, corridors, and courtyards strong enough to provide a setting for every feeling of ceremony. Rudolf II's collections did not live in emptiness. They lived within an urban world already marked by Gothic form, by ritual character, and by the slightly somber atmosphere of old stone. Thus, when one thinks of them, one does not see only objects. One also sees an atmosphere, the small sound of footsteps across a gallery floor, low light falling across paintings, silent attendants, whispered introductions, and the feeling that behind every object there is a story longer than the room that contains it. And if one had to keep a final image from this chapter, it would perhaps be the image of Prague Castle on a quiet afternoon. Outside, the city is still living its everyday life with stone bridges, squares, and narrow streets, but inside a long room, beneath a vaulted ceiling, objects from many different lands lie side by side within a new order. They no longer belong entirely to the places that gave them birth. They have been drawn into the imagination of empire, and it is there, among collections, wonders, and imperial imagination, that Prague appears not merely as a capital. It appears as a bold human effort to reduce the world, not in order to make it smaller, but so that one might stand within it, look around, and believe that every beauty, every mystery, every rare thing in creation might, in some fleeting moment, be made to exist together beneath one roof. Not everything cherished by an age remains intact with the city that gave birth to it. Some things vanish very quickly. A court dissolves. A collection is moved elsewhere. A room is given a different function. A network of patrons that once created the singular atmosphere of an entire era quietly breaks apart piece by piece. Prague did not escape that law. After Rudolf II died in Prague in 1612, the world he had built began to crack before long. The religious and political tensions in Bohemia helped lead to the defenestration of Prague in 1618, and with it opened a long age of war in Europe. And yet the strange thing is that even when an age ends, a city never ends with it in quite the same way. Prague no longer preserves exactly the Prague of Rudolf II, but Prague remains, not as a frozen image from the year 1600, but as a place that has absorbed that age into its stone, into the rhythm of its streets, into its own urban memory. UNESCO describes the historic center of Prague as a complex that developed continuously from the 11th to the 18th century. In its assessment of outstanding universal value, the organization further emphasizes that Prague admirably illustrates the process of continuous urban growth from the Middle Ages to the present day. In other words, what remains is not merely a handful of individual monuments, but the city's very ability to continue living without losing the layers of the past that shaped it. Perhaps that is the truest way to step out of the story of Rudolf II. He transformed Prague into a center of art, of alchemy, of astronomy, of collections, and of imperial imagination. But not everything he gathered into Prague agreed to remain there. Prague Castle Picture Gallery notes that after Rudolf died, his successor, Matthias, gradually moved the collection to Vienna. What remained in Prague was later taken by the Swedish army in the final phase of the 30 Years' War. At the same time, official sources from Prague Castle and Prague, EU, both show that a part of that legacy still lives on today in the Prague Castle Picture Gallery, where works connected to Rudolf II's famous collection are displayed. and a painting tradition rooted in the late 16th century is preserved. That makes Prague a city both of loss and of endurance. Loss, because the world of wonders once gathered here no longer survives whole. Endurance, because even after the objects were dispersed, the city still kept the setting, the roots, the spaces of power, and the historical atmosphere that had once given those objects their meaning. Galleries may change their contents, but the corridors remain. Collections may be dismantled, but Prague Castle still looks down upon the city like the center of a memory older than any human lifetime. Figures such as Tycho Brahe, Kepler, or Kelly may long have departed from living life. Yet Prague still preserves the kind of atmosphere that makes it feel entirely natural for later generations to remember them here. It is precisely this that makes Prague different from a mere old city. It does not preserve architecture alone. It preserves the ability to evoke a world that has passed. And if one walks through Prague with that thought in mind, one begins to realize that what remains does not always lie in the most conspicuous things. Sometimes it lies in the way the parts of the city still fit together. The old town, the lesser town, the new town, the castle district, and the bridge binding them into a single body. Just as UNESCO sees its urban structure as an outstanding example of continuous growth across many centuries. What remains is not only each individual building, but the feeling that this city still understands how to function as itself. One can still sense Prague's older logic in the way spaces open and close, in the way a route leads a pedestrian from square to bridge, from bridge up toward the castle, from a civic zone into one carrying a more solemn air of power and ceremony. What remains, therefore, is not only stone. It is the relationship between those masses of stone. It lies in the fact that a square is still a square. A bridge is still a place people cross. A tower is still a point toward which the eye lifts. A road still holds the memory of footsteps, processions, exchanges, mornings and evenings repeated there for far too long to be forgotten. There are cities that lose their memory when their component parts are severed, replaced, or pushed out of their original logic. But Prague seems to have preserved something more delicate. Its spaces still speak to one another. A person crossing Charles Bridge today may not cross it for the reason someone in the 16th century once did. Yet, the bridge still performs exactly what it has done for centuries. It joins the parts of the city together. A square may no longer carry the same faces, the same cries, the same goods. Yet it still remains a place of gathering, an open space where the city exposes itself to light and to the eyes of others. A narrow street still leads into shadow before opening out beneath a wider sky. A bell tower still makes the human gaze lift upward, almost by instinct. And perhaps that is the deepest point in the way Prague remains. The city does not need to preserve every old object intact in order to remain itself. Sometimes it is enough simply to preserve the way things connect. For the memory of a city does not lie only in artifacts. It also lies in the rhythm of movement to which those artifacts once belonged, in the fact that people still cross the river at that very place, still gather in those same open spaces, still live among the parts of the city according to an order not entirely new, but one worn smooth across many centuries. That makes Prague appear not as a city left over after history, but as a city still continuing its own history. That is why, When one passes through Prague, one often feels something difficult to name. The past here does not lie entirely behind oneself. It surrounds oneself, not like a ghost, but like a structure still in operation. A bridge does not merely evoke memory, it still connects. A square was not merely once a place of gathering, it still opens to let people enter. A street did not merely once witness ceremony and daily life. It still permits new movements to pass through upon an older logic. And there is in that a rare beauty, the beauty of a city that does not need to freeze the past in order to keep it. It need only continue being itself for long enough and remain faithful enough to its deepest form, so that the centuries do not vanish but settle into the present. Prague also remains in another sense, as a city written over many times, yet never erased. After Rudolf II came religious upheaval, war, dynastic change, the Baroque centuries, then modernization and the harsh political history of Central Europe. And yet, rather than being swallowed whole by any one age, Prague absorbed all those ages into layers. Britannica describes Prague's history as a long sequence in which the city continuously held an important political, religious, and cultural role. UNESCO, meanwhile, regards the richness of its architecture and artistic traditions as the reason Prague became an urban model of broad influence across Central and Eastern Europe. This means that the Prague that remained should not be understood as stillness. It is survival through change. Perhaps that is why the city always carries two opposite sensations at once. On one hand, it makes one feel that a vast amount of time has passed here. The walls, the bell towers, the facades, and the bridges all say that very clearly. On the other hand, Prague does not feel like a place belonging only to the past. It is still a living city, still giving off sound, still receiving pedestrians across the bridge, still holding light in its windows when night falls, still continuing to do what it has done for centuries, hold people, hold memory, hold ambition, hold change. What remains, therefore, is not a dead remnant. It is a continuity, a very long current of life. Seen from that angle, even what Prague has lost helps make it what it is. The fact that Rudolf's collection was moved away and plundered is not only a sad story. It also makes one see more clearly the truth that a city cannot be defined only by what it possesses at any given moment. Prague was once the place where the greatest painting collections in Europe were gathered. Today, even though only part of that legacy remains in the Prague Castle Picture Gallery, the memory of that age is still inseparable from the city's identity. The city remembers even what it has lost, and sometimes that kind of memory is stronger than mere physical presence. For in the end, what remains longest in a city is rarely what can most easily be counted. Not the number of paintings, not the number of bells, not the number of towers, not the number of artifacts left in a museum. What remains longest is usually the way people feel the city. And Prague holds that feeling in an extraordinary way. It is still a place where one may stand upon a bridge, look toward the castle, walk through the old town, lift one's eyes to a bell tower, and feel that the centuries have never entirely departed. Not because everything here remains unchanged, but because the structure, the atmosphere, and the density of memory remain intact enough that the past does not dissolve into something wholly abstract. UNESCO calls it a historic center of outstanding universal value. The walker within the city might call it more simply this: a place where time can still be felt through the body. And then there is yet another Prague, not only the Prague of Rudolph II, of bell towers, galleries, and Gothic streets, but Prague in the mind of the present-day observer, for people today. That city often appears as a place standing almost upon the border between the real and the dreamlike. One arrives there and feels not merely that one has stepped into a location, but into a state of mind, a place where time slows, where stone, water, bells, and mist make all movement seem less hurried in modern memory. Prague is not only a historical capital, it is a city of atmosphere, a place where simply standing on a bridge and watching the river darken, or lifting one's eyes to see towers emerging against a gray sky, already gives one the feeling of touching a layer of Europe deeper, older, and quieter than the ordinary world. Perhaps that is why Prague continues to live so powerfully in the modern imagination, as a city of unshowy beauty, of history that does not need to raise its voice, and of a strangely inexpressible longing, the feeling that here, even though the age has changed, one may still walk among old streets and hear some very quiet part of oneself. And so, as our story comes to its close here, Prague appears not as a sealed museum, nor as a stage reserved only for nostalgia. It appears as a city that was once the capital of an imperial imagination, that once held alchemical furnaces, measurements of the stars, collections that made all Europe look upward, and then continued onward through loss, war, dispersal, and change. What remains is not an untouchable intactness. What remains is the ability to go on being Prague, a Prague of stone and mist, of towers and bells, of narrow streets and squares opening like memory, of rooms that once held wonders, and of a city where even after so much has departed, its deepest core still stands unmoving, looking down over the Vltava, slow and enduring, as though it had never learned how to disappear. And now, as our journey through Prague is slowly coming to its final steps, perhaps you have already felt that this city was never merely a backdrop to history. Tonight, we have passed through old layers of stone, over bridges, beneath towers, into enclosed rooms where human beings tried to read the secrets of matter, beneath rooftops where patient eyes turned upward toward the sky, and through streets where daily life continued beneath the steady ringing of bells hour after hour. We have seen a Prague that was at once deeply real and almost dreamlike, a city where early science, faith, power, ceremony, and imagination once existed side by side without sensing the contradiction that we so often assume today. Perhaps that, too, is what has made Prague remain so long in human memory. Not only because it is beautiful, but because it has preserved the feeling that time here does not entirely pass away. It settles into the stone, into the sound of bells, into the darkness of old corridors, and into the stories that each century leaves behind, then quietly hands to the next. If you have stayed with me all the way to this point, thank you very much for giving a part of this quiet night to the story. Leave me a comment and let me know which part of Prague stayed with you most. Was it the alchemists, the stars above the city, the bells, or the mist-covered Gothic streets? I always love reading where each person found themselves lingering in a historical journey like this. And if tonight's story helped you relax, support the video with a like, or subscribe to the channel to continue joining these slow journeys through old cities, lost civilizations, and worlds from which time has not yet fully departed. And now, let your mind grow still a little more. The night has deepened, and somewhere, in a Prague very far away, the final bell has perhaps just faded into the mist.